They say history changes slowly, over centuries, through politics and kings. But sometimes, it changes in a single afternoon. On August 26, 1346, in a muddy field near the small village of Crécy, France, the old world of knights and chivalry met its bloody end. What began as yet another medieval battle would become a revolution in warfare, one where the bow defeated the sword and common peasants brought down the mightiest nobles in Europe. This was not just a fight for territory, it was the death of an era. August 26, 1346. In a muddy field near Crécy, France, 9,000 exhausted Englishmen were about to face 30,000 of Europe's finest knights. The French had every advantage: superior numbers, heavy cavalry, and the flower of European nobility in their ranks. They were so confident that French nobles argued over who would have the honor of killing the English king. For hours later, 1,500 French nobles were dead, including princes, dukes, and kings. The English lost only 40 men. Not 440. The age of the armored knight, 500 years of military dominance, ended in a single afternoon, destroyed by peasants with sticks and strings. The blind king of Bohemia charged directly into death because he refused to miss the slaughter. French knights trampled their own allies to death as they fled. The Genoese crossbowmen were massacred by the very French nobles who had hired them. And for weeks afterward, crows grew so fat on noble flesh that they could barely fly. This was the Battle of Crécy, where medieval warfare died in the mud, where the entire idea of nobility through combat was destroyed by common-born archers, and where the 100 Years' War truly began with France's most humiliating defeat. By the end of this story, it will be clear how a weapon that cost 10 shillings destroyed armor worth 1,000 pounds. Why French knights murdered their own mercenaries in the middle of battle, and how one blind king's suicidal charge became the most insanely noble death in military history. Edward III of England had just landed in Normandy with about 15,000 men, claiming the French throne through his mother's lineage. He had been burning his way across northern France in what was called a chevauchée, basically licensed plundering designed to prove that the French king could not protect his own people. The English had just looted Caen and were trying to escape to English-held Calais when the French army finally caught up. Philip VI of France had assembled the largest army in Christendom, between 30 and 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry, knights in full-plate armor mounted on armored horses. These weren't just soldiers. This was nearly every important noble in France, plus allied kings and princes from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent troops. The King of Bohemia came with his entire court. Moravia sent knights. It was like a medieval Avengers assembly, and they all wanted English blood. The French knights were the tanks of medieval warfare. A fully armored knight on an armored horse weighed close to a ton. They had been bred for war since childhood, trained in combat since they could walk. Their armor cost more than a peasant village earned in a lifetime. For 500 years, heavy cavalry charges had decided European battles. Infantry existed to be trampled. Archers were seen as annoyances. Real men, noble men, fought with swords on horseback. Edward III knew he was doomed, outnumbered 3-1, exhausted from weeks of raiding, and low on supplies. But he had something the French didn't respect: 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen, mostly peasants and criminals who had been practicing with their bows since childhood because English law required it. Every Sunday after church, English males were legally obligated to practice archery. It was literally illegal to play other sports if they could be practicing with a bow. The longbow was a simple weapon, a 6-foot piece of wood. Nothing fancy, but in trained hands, it was devastating. These archers could put 12 arrows per minute into a target at 250 yards. That's an arrow every 5 seconds, accurately, at a distance of 2.5 football fields. The draw weight was so heavy, between 150 and 180 pounds, that archaeologists today can identify longbow archers by their deformed skeletons. Their left arms were often longer than their right from years of drawing those massive bows. Edward positioned his army on a hill near Crécy, forcing the French to attack uphill. He arranged his men in 3 divisions, with the archers forming a V-shape between them, creating overlapping fields of fire. Then he did something that shocked both armies. He had his knights dismount and fight on foot. English nobles fighting like common infantry. It was unprecedented. But Edward understood something the French did not. The age of the mounted knight was ending. Edward's decision to dismount his knights sent shockwaves through his own ranks. These men had trained their entire lives for the thunder of the charge, their war horses worth more than gold. To step down and fight like peasants was an insult to centuries of tradition. But Edward forced the issue, reminding them that survival mattered more than pride. And slowly, knights in polished plate trudged into the mud beside archers in wool hoods, a sight no one in Christendom had ever seen before. The English camp was eerily calm the night before the battle. Archers prepared their longbows, rubbing beeswax into their strings to keep them dry. Stakes were hammered into the earth, and ditches were dug by torchlight. Chronicles say that Edward even had meat and ale distributed, so his men slept with full stomachs, while the French army staggered hungry into camp after a forced march. Every detail screamed discipline versus arrogance. The English also prepared the battlefield. They dug pits and trenches in front of their position to break up cavalry charges. They drove sharpened stakes into the ground at angles to impale horses. They turned the terrain into a killing field while the French were still marching, and then they waited. Meanwhile, on the French side, it was chaos disguised as pageantry. Nobles rode past each other in gleaming armor, banners snapping in the wind, each one more resplendent than the last. Dukes and counts squabbled openly about who would have the honor of leading the charge or capturing Edward alive for ransom. Some bragged they would bring the English king back in chains before nightfall. Philip VI's attempts to calm his nobles were drowned out by the clamor of trumpets and shouts. The army looked less like a disciplined force and more like a tournament gone mad. And as the sun began to set over the muddy fields of northern France, the stage was set not just for a battle, but for the end of an entire way of war. When dawn broke on August 26th, the French vanguard found itself marching through a wasteland. What had once been the heart of northern France was now nothing but the smoking aftermath of King Edward III Chevauche. A brutal scorched earth campaign designed to cripple France's economy and morale. The smell of charred wood and burned grain hung heavy in the air. Villages lay in ruins, their houses still smoldering from the English fires. Scattered livestock roamed aimlessly. Fields of wheat had been reduced to ash, and the once fertile land looked like a battlefield long before swords were drawn. Peasants watched from the shadows of their destroyed homes, whispering curses under their breath as thousands of glittering French knights rode past, their armor gleaming coldly in the morning light. To these knights, the devastation they witnessed was not merely an outrage. It was humiliation, a direct insult to French honor that demanded immediate revenge. But for the English, this was victory before the battle even began. Edward III's strategy was working perfectly. The land itself had become his weapon. By the afternoon of August 26th, after a grueling march beneath the late summer sun, King Philip VI's massive army finally arrived near the small village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. It was around 4 o'clock, and his men were exhausted. The long columns of infantry, knights, and mercenaries had been on the move for hours with little rest or organization. The sensible decision would have been to halt, regroup, and launch an attack the following morning when the army was refreshed and properly arrayed. Philip, aware of this, initially gave that very order to rest and wait. But the fiery pride of the French nobility had other plans. Patience was a virtue few of them possessed. When they spotted the English army drawn up on a hill to the north, outnumbered, far from home, and seemingly cornered, they saw not caution but opportunity. To them, this was destiny. They could already taste the glory of capturing or killing the English king himself. The French camp buzzed with excitement and arrogance, the sound of steel clashing as nobles prepared for battle despite their king's command to stand down. As the French army debated its next move, dark clouds gathered overhead. A sudden rainstorm swept across the fields, soaking men, horses, and weapons alike. The French knights laughed off the downpour, trusting in their heavy plate armor to protect them from the elements. But the storm brought an unseen danger, one that would change the entire course of the battle. The English longbowmen, experienced veterans of countless campaigns, immediately unstrung their bows and tucked the strings beneath their helmets and cloaks to keep them dry. The Genoese crossbowmen fighting for the French, however, were not so cautious. Their crossbow strings, made of twisted sinew, stretched and slackened when wet, losing all power and accuracy. It was a small detail, barely noticed in the moment, but that detail would determine the fate of thousands before the day was done. When the storm finally passed and the sun broke through again, Philip VI reached the front lines and surveyed the field. The English army stood calmly on the slope ahead, banners fluttering proudly in the wind, their defensive line tight and disciplined. Seeing this, Philip reaffirmed his earlier order. His army would wait until morning to rest and prepare for a coordinated attack. But the command came too late. Behind him, the restless French nobility grew impatient. They shouted that daylight was fading, that glory was slipping away, and that victory was within reach. Some began lowering their lances. Others spurred their horses forward. Within moments, the royal command dissolved into chaos. The most powerful army in Europe had become a mob of ambitious men driven by pride, not strategy. The Battle of Crécy had begun, not by design, but by arrogance. The first to move were the Genoese crossbowmen, around 5,000 professional mercenaries from Italy, hired at great expense to serve as the French army's ranged vanguard. But the moment they advanced, their disadvantages became clear. Their large shields, known as pavises, which they used to take cover while reloading, were still with the baggage train miles behind. And after the rain, their crossbow strings were stretched and limp, drastically reducing their range and power. As they trudged forward through the mud, they loosed their first volley at about 150 yards. The bolts fell far short of the English line. The English archers, their bows dry and ready, waited for the perfect moment, and then, with a single signal, unleashed hell. 5,000 longbows sang in unison, their strings snapping back with the sound of rolling thunder. The sky turned black with arrows. Witnesses later said it was like a storm cloud descending upon the field. Each English archer could fire 12 arrows per minute, more than 60,000 arrows in the first minute alone. The Genoese were cut down in waves, their armor and courage useless against the relentless rain of death. Within moments, they broke ranks and began to flee. But their retreat enraged the French knights behind them. Count d'Alençon, furious that the mercenaries were blocking the charge, shouted, "Kill this rabble that stands in our way." The order was obeyed with terrifying speed. The French knights spurred forward, trampling and slashing their own soldiers as they tried to retreat. The Genoese were trapped between the English arrows ahead and the French blades behind. Those who survived fled the battlefield entirely, cursing the arrogance of their employers. Now came a main French assault. 12,000 mounted knights, one of the most formidable cavalry forces in medieval Europe, charged uphill through churned mud and over the bodies of the dead Genoese. The English longbowmen did not waver. Their arrows struck the charging horses first, targeting eyes, throats, and joints. Even armored war horses could not withstand the piercing bodkin points of English arrows. Animals screamed, stumbled, and fell, throwing their riders into chaos. The once powerful charge lost all momentum as knights, collided with fallen horses, their formation dissolving into confusion. Those who reached the English lines faced hidden ditches, sharpened stakes, and relentless close-range fire. At under 100 yards, the longbow's power became unstoppable. Arrows punched through visors, found gaps beneath arms, and slipped through mail into flesh. Even when the arrows failed to penetrate, the sheer impact was enough to stun or bruise the men inside their armor. It was like being struck by a hammer again and again. The French knights advanced in wave after wave, each one climbing over the bodies of the last, only to meet the same fate. English archers had pre-planted arrows in the ground before them for speed, and they fired continuously without pause. Chroniclers described the arrows falling so thick that they looked like snow. The French were blinded by the storm of missiles, their shouts of valor replaced by screams of panic and pain. But the English preparation extended beyond arrows. The battlefield itself was a weapon. The ground had been carefully chosen and fortified. Hidden pits broke horses' legs, and wooden stakes impaled riders. The earlier rain turned the soil into a quagmire where armored men could barely move. Those who fell could not stand again. They drowned in mud or were finished by English infantry. When the archers ran out of arrows, they didn't stop. They ran forward into the field, pulling arrows from the bodies of fallen knights, and fired them back. The French were being killed with their own suffering, one shaft at a time. And then, amid the carnage, came one of history's most poignant moments. John of Bohemia, the blind king of Bohemia, had been without sight for 10 years, but had still come to fight alongside his allies. When he heard the battle was lost, he refused to retreat. The king of Bohemia does not flee from battle, he is said to have declared. He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, so they could lead him forward into the fray. Blind and 50 years old, John charged into the chaos, swinging his sword at the sounds of war he could not see. He and his knights were all cut down together. When their bodies were found after the battle, they were still tied by their reins. John's sword remained in his hand. He had struck one final blow before dying, fulfilling his vow. Prince Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, was so moved by John's courage that he adopted his emblem: 3 ostrich feathers and the motto Ich dien, meaning I serve. That same symbol endures today as the emblem of the Prince of Wales, a lasting reminder of valor in the face of impossible odds. As the sun sank below the horizon, the field of Crécy was carpeted with bodies. The French had charged 16 times, 16 futile assaults of knights driven by pride rather than discipline. Each charge was less organized than the last, as nobles fought one another to reach the front and seize honor for themselves. But there was no honor left to take, only death. The Battle of Crécy ended not just as a triumph for England, but as a turning point in warfare. The age of the knight was dying, and the age of disciplined strategy and ranged weapons had begun. What started as a quest for glory ended as a lesson written in blood, that arrogance and pride could destroy even the mightiest of kings. The field at Crécy had fallen silent, but the horror that unfolded there would echo for centuries. King Philip VI himself had led the final desperate charge. His horse was shot from under him, and an arrow tore through his jaw. Even then, he refused to retreat until his personal guard dragged him from the chaos. Around him, the sacred oriflamme, the holy battle banner of France, said to guarantee victory, lay abandoned in the mud. As darkness descended, the English soldiers could hardly comprehend what had happened. They held their ground through the night, cutting down any wounded Frenchman who dared move. Their arrows long spent, they fought with knives, hammers, and sharpened stakes. English peasant archers bludgeoned French nobles to death with clubs and sticks. When dawn broke on August 27th, the full magnitude of the slaughter revealed itself. The finest of French nobility lay scattered and broken across the field. The Counts of Flanders, Blois, and Alsace, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of St. Pol, names that once commanded fear, now lifeless in the mud. Over 1,500 nobles were dead, including 11 princes and thousands of knights. The Genoese crossbowmen, those who hadn't fled, were cut down, many by their own allies. In contrast, the English lost around 40 men, only 2 of them knights. One English knight had fallen for every 750 French nobles. Chroniclers of the time refused to believe it. Some called it divine intervention. But the truth was simpler. In a single afternoon, the longbow had rendered heavy cavalry obsolete. Yet the true devastation went beyond numbers. In medieval warfare, nobles were rarely killed. They were captured for ransom, a gentleman's code that made war profitable for the elite. But at Crécy, the English archers, common men without regard for chivalric honor, ignored that code entirely. They loosed arrows into the faces of dukes and counts, indifferent to the bloodlines they were erasing. For the European aristocracy, the psychological impact was catastrophic. For centuries, noble birth had been equated with martial superiority. God's blessing made knights better at war. But at Crécy, Welsh peasants with bent sticks proved otherwise. Superiority no longer came from lineage, but from technology and discipline. The medieval social order itself trembled. The aftermath was grotesque. The dead were so numerous that no one of suitable rank remained to bury them. Bodies rotted in the summer heat. Crows and wolves gorged on the flesh of princes. Peasants stripped corpses of their finery, their lives transformed by the gold and jewels they scavenged. The once proud armor of knights was melted down and sold. The English army, stunned by its own victory, marched onward to Calais, leaving behind a landscape littered with glittering corpses. The locals later called it the Field of the Cloth of Gold, for the silks and velvets that still shimmered among the dead. For years, farmers plowing those fields unearthed bones and rusted armor, grim reminders of that August day. France was left in shock. The sudden loss of so many nobles created chaos. Whole regions were leaderless, administrative systems collapsed, and the military had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Crossbowmen were recruited in greater numbers, new archer units formed, and, humiliatingly, French generals began copying English tactics, fighting on foot instead of charging on horseback. The longbow had changed everything. The age of glorious cavalry charges was over. Battles would now be decided at range, through discipline and firepower, not by swordplay or gallantry. The romance of medieval warfare died in the mud at Crécy. Yet France failed to learn the lesson. A decade later, at Poitiers, they made the same mistake, charging uphill into English archers. The result was the same. Another king captured, thousands more nobles slain. It would take nearly a century for the French to truly adapt, to accept that a peasant archer could be more valuable than a knight. The social implications ran even deeper. If commoners could destroy nobles, what did that say about divine right? If Welsh criminals could kill princes, what justified the feudal system? Crécy didn't just destroy an army. It shattered the idea that noble blood carried inherent superiority. For a brief time, the English longbowmen became the most feared soldiers in Europe. But their reign, too, was temporary. The weapon demanded years of training, an entire lifetime to master. When gunpowder arrived, the longbow's power vanished overnight. Muskets required no skill, only a steady hand. The weapon that killed chivalry was itself slain by progress. Among the fallen was the blind king of Bohemia, whose final charge became legend. Guided into battle by his men, he chose certain death over retreat, striking one last blow for honor. His death marked the end of an age when nobility meant more than wealth, when valor mattered more than survival. Today, military historians regard Crécy as a revolution in warfare. It demonstrated that technology and tactics outweighed courage and numbers, that discipline could overcome chaos, and that firepower could shatter centuries of tradition. But the most haunting image remains: French knights, the proud elite of Christendom, trampling their own allies to reach the English lines, only to be cut down by calm, mud-splattered archers firing with mathematical precision. The Count of Alassa, who had ordered the massacre of his own Genoese crossbowmen, was shot through the face moments later. The French killed more of their own than the English lost in total. Even the crows grew too fat to fly, waddling from corpse to corpse, bloated on royal flesh. It was a perfect metaphor for a world devouring itself. Today, a small monument marks the site of Crécy. Tourists rarely stop. Few remember what happened there. But on that muddy slope in 1346, the medieval world came to an end. 5 centuries of tradition, the notion of knightly honor, and the very idea of noble superiority all died that day, cut down by commoners with wooden bows. The English didn't just win a battle. They proved that courage couldn't defeat physics, that bloodlines couldn't stop arrows, and that the age of the knight was over. France lost more than men that day. They lost their faith in the world as they knew it. And all it took was 5,000 peasants who practiced archery every Sunday after church.